Welcome to the First Person Politics Briefing Room, and thank you for purchasing a membership. My name is David Rosen, founder and senior analyst at First Person Politics, a consulting firm specializing in political psychology. I founded First Person Politics to help political consultants, advocacy groups, and leaders take advantage of all that political psychology has to offer. As an intellectual discipline, political psychology is as old as political science, but most of the field's greatest discoveries, hard-won insights, and experimental findings remain unknown to people working in politics and public affairs. I'm here to change that, and I want to help you become part of that change. Generations in Congress, the political life cycle of generations. This online seminar will introduce you to generational dynamics as they apply to the United States Congress. If you haven't already watched our free seminar, Generational Theory 101, we strongly suggest that you do so before continuing any further, unless you're already well acquainted with generational theory. This seminar is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 will review the basic elements of modern generational theory. Part 2 will introduce you to generational governing temperaments, the political life cycle of generations, and the recent history of generations as they've moved through that life cycle in Congress. Finally, Part 3 will look at what the future may have in store for Congress specifically and for American politics more generally. So without further ado, let's begin. Part 1, a review of generational theory. Generational theory is the system of thought revealing how generational replacement drives history. First-person politics embraces generational theory because of its extraordinary analytic and predictive power. There are 3 cycles that define modern generational theory. The first is the human life cycle, which has 4 stages: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood, each lasting perhaps a bit over 20 years. The second cycle is that of generational archetypes. Idealist, reactive, civic, and adaptive generations are born in that order at about 20-year intervals, and each type of generation has a specific and predictable set of characteristics, preferences, and values. The third cycle is the cycle of seasonal turnings in history. History, like a typical calendar year, has seasons that typically last about 20 years. A high is like a spring, an awakening is like summer, an unraveling is like fall, and a crisis is like winter. A full cycle of all 4 turnings is called a saeculum, and it typically spans about 80 to 84 years. If what I'm saying right now doesn't make any sense to you, or if you're feeling confused by the material on this slide, it means you need to go back and watch Generational Theory 101. All of these concepts are explained in much greater detail and with far greater clarity in that seminar. If, on the other hand, all this feels familiar, then it's time to cover new ground. Part 2, Generations in Congress. Each generational archetype has what we like to call a governing temperament, which reflects how they typically behave in power. Governing temperaments represent an aggregate of behaviors and characteristics that we typically see from each generation in midlife and in early elderhood, when they move into positions of institutional authority and political leadership. Because these are generational temperaments and not a list of individual personality traits, some leaders may embody them more than others. There are always going to be exceptions in any generation, leaders who for one reason or another don't seem to fit the profile, but generally speaking, most leaders in a generation will. Usually the most prominent leaders of a generation will come to represent the perfect distillation of these temperaments. When idealist generations like the baby boomers or the missionaries take power, they tend to behave in ways that are expressive, idealistic, individualistic, moralistic, narcissistic, outspoken, and polarizing, again, regardless of which party they belong to or the particulars of their political beliefs, policies, and demands. When reactive generations like Gen X or the Lost Generation take power, they tend to behave in ways that are competitive, cynical, direct, frugal, jaded, pragmatic, and pugnacious. When civic generations like the Millennials or the Greatest Generation take power, they tend to behave in ways that are ambitious, cooperative, expansive, humanistic, optimistic, productive, and rational. And finally, when adaptive generations like the Silent Generation or the Young Plurals take power, they tend to behave in ways that are conciliatory, establishmentarian, institutionalist, proceduralist, respectful, and technocratic. These governing temperaments matter because they are the main drivers of political and policy change, at least as far as our governing institutions are concerned. Generational changes in Congress matter at least as much as other factors like party, ideology, or region, and there is a large amount of historical evidence to prove it. It's only ignorance of generational theory that has kept people from noticing. Before I present some of that evidence, it's important to understand the political life cycle of generations. There's a process by which each generation enters the electorate and then Congress, gains power for a time, and then falls from it. The political life cycle is the yardstick by which we can measure and anticipate each generation's power and influence. Here's what that cycle looks like. Before I walk you through the different stages, I want to spend some time on methodology, starting by addressing the age ranges listed in the left-hand column. These age ranges are tied to the first birth year of a generation. So let's use millennials as an example, who were born starting in 1982. When the children born in 1982 reach their early 30s, it means someone from the millennial generation will be elected to Congress. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone born in 1982 will be elected, only that someone born after 1982 will arrive in Congress. The initial birth year of a generation serves as a useful and stable benchmark by which we can track and predict a generation's progress into and then out of the halls of power. The reason this table uses age ranges rather than specific ages is because the political life cycle, like the natural life cycle, is an organic process. While some life cycle events are defined by laws and customs, such as the legal voting age or the age of retirement, others, like weddings and funerals, happen entirely on their own time, or they may occur at an approximate time, like the midlife crisis, which often occurs around age 45 to 50, or the onset of puberty, which typically starts around age 10 to 12. The political life cycle falls into this third category. It isn't completely arbitrary, but neither is it precisely defined. There's a 2-year margin of error on either side. The age ranges listed in this table are based on an average of all the post-Civil War American generations. After careful examination and consideration, we actually threw out the data from the generations prior to the Civil War. That's because in the pre-industrial world, people ascended to power at significantly younger ages. It makes no sense to include these pre-modern generations in our averages if the patterns of their life cycle differed substantially and predictably from our own. By omitting the founding and post-founding era generations from our research, we were able to establish a consistent set of age benchmarks for the modern political life cycle. Our decision to list these as approximate ages rather than specific ages or age ranges reflects the consistent 2-year margin of error we found in the data. In the last 150 years of American political history and 8 generations, there have only been 2 instances when a generation deviated from one of the benchmarks listed here. In the first instance, the progressive generation achieved largest minority status a few years earlier than expected. In the second instance, Generation X reached that same benchmark a few years later than expected. We'll talk more about what to expect next from Gen Xers in Part 3 and why they may be running a little late to the proverbial party. The approximate ages listed in this table apply equally to the House and to the Senate. However, the margin of error in the Senate is much wider, 4 years instead of 2. This greater variability is probably a reflection of the Senate's exclusivity and smaller size. In other words, it's harder to get elected to the Senate, and there are fewer opportunities to do so. And as a result, the political life cycle of generations in the Senate isn't nearly as precise as it is in the House, even though the basic trajectory and relative timing are more or less the same. One other key difference between the House and the Senate is that the House is a majoritarian body, while the Senate is a minoritarian one, which means that the minority has a lot more power in the Senate. The 3 bolded thresholds in this table are each very important in both chambers. But because the House operates under majority rules, that first majority threshold seems to be the most crucial one in the House, whereas in the Senate, largest minority and peak power seem to matter a bit more because of the Senate's filibuster rule. When a generation becomes the largest minority, they gain the ability to engage in endless procedural delay by mounting a filibuster. Later on, when that generation approaches the peak of its power, they gain the numbers and the institutional leverage necessary to overcome a filibuster. That makes the largest minority and peak power thresholds much more crucial in the Senate. This isn't something you need to dwell on for the purposes of this seminar, but if you plan to do additional research or analysis into generations in Congress, you need to be aware of the institutional differences between the 2 chambers. Okay, with all that said, Let's walk through the political life cycle from start to finish. The cycle begins with a happy event, the birth of a new generation. From birth to age 17, a generation has virtually no political influence whatsoever. During childhood, generational values and preferences are formed, while the children themselves serve mainly as political props. The babies that politicians kiss, the children and teenagers in family portraits and photos of students, and the kids referred to in the famous expression, kids these days. To the extent that children have any political influence at all, it's through adult perceptions of and interactions with them. In one era, expectations of children may be loose or loosening. In another era, they may be tight or tightening. Likewise, parents may be more or less responsive to the needs of their children or engage with their lives. These tendencies may even be reflected in general social attitudes toward children, as well as in government policies that directly or indirectly affect the lives of children. What's important to remember is that the children themselves actually have very little influence. They're at the mercy of and formed by the choices that parents and adults make. The first real turning point in the political life cycle is when a generation turns 18. Today, this is the age when Americans become eligible to vote. Prior to 1971, the legal voting age was set at age 21. Although generational preferences and values are formed in childhood, 18 is when generational voting habits and partisan political affiliations typically begin to form. Around the time the oldest members of a generation reach their late 20s, the media starts to notice their existence as a political force that could sooner or later reshape the electorate. The reason new generations aren't noticed when they first enter the electorate is because there aren't enough of them voting at that point to make any difference. It takes 5 to 10 years worth of a generation aging into the electorate before they can even make a difference at the ballot box. Consider that the oldest millennials actually started voting in the 2000 election. But the millennial generation didn't attract widespread attention as a political force until 2008. That's very typical of the generational political life cycle. A few years later, when a generation reaches their early 30s, one of their own will be elected to Congress for the first time. During their first 10 to 15 years in Congress, members of the new generation will have very little influence. Their leadership will mostly be symbolic, though it may foreshadow developments later on. After initially entering Congress, members from a new generation may even form youth caucuses that contradict the prevailing ways of doing things. Until the new generation becomes the second largest generation in the chamber, these efforts will have little or no practical effect. When a new generation becomes the largest minority in their mid-40s, their young guns and rising stars will begin asserting themselves in ways that garner significant attention. While not yet decisive or determinative, their generation's boldest policy initiatives and most disruptive political strategies will begin to influence national debates and shape the conversation. At this stage, the most provocative leaders from the new generation become identified with potential new directions, ideologies, and possibilities for their party and for the country. But the generation's preferences are still not yet decisive when it comes to legislation, policy, and governing. When the rising generation achieves a majority in their mid-50s, that's when their preferences and priorities finally become decisive. Majority status is often accompanied by a significant shift in the tone and political dynamics of the legislative body. Members of the older generation quickly come to be identified with the old guard if they fail to adapt to the changes at hand, and members of the rising generation come to be identified as the new guard. Legislative and political priorities change as powerful new figures assume leadership roles and responsibilities. New ways of doing things are instituted. The new generation's agenda becomes the official agenda. For better and for worse, politics are never again the same. When the oldest members of a generation reach their mid-60s, their generation reaches the peak of their political power. At this stage, the generation's governing temperament and legislative priorities reach their fullest and clearest expression. Their political dominance is unquestioned, so much so that their governing temperament may even appear permanent, as if those in power always behave this way and always will forevermore. Of course, this appearance of permanence is just an illusion. As anyone who studies generational cycles knows, whatever goes up will sooner or later come back down, and usually on a fairly predictable timetable. When the generation reaches their mid-70s, it's around this time that they will lose their majority status and be displaced by the generation behind them. At this phase of the political life cycle, the now aging generation will occupy positions of senior leadership such as committee chairmanships, and they must share power with the generation behind them, often to their own displeasure. It now falls to them to temper the excesses of their junior counterparts or adjust to the new political realities. As a generation moves into its 80s, they begin their final exit from senior leadership roles and their exit from political power and influence. Their few remaining leaders will usually serve in an elder statesman role as symbolic keepers of the flame and guardians of old traditions. On occasion, elder statesmen will be called upon to cast a decisive vote on a crucial issue or make a dramatic display of their considerable moral authority. Since their health, intellect, and stamina may be deteriorating, there's generally little else they can do. The political life cycle of a generation usually comes to an end in their 90s. Not only do they vanish from Congress, but their electoral influence rapidly diminishes. Death is a part of life, and every generation, no matter how much we love them or hate them, must eventually die to make room for their successors. The political life cycle is complete and begins again with a new generation. If this model of the political life cycle is correct, we would expect to see fairly dramatic changes in American politics, particularly congressional politics, whenever a new generation gained its first majority. Indeed, those changes should reflect the governing temperament of the generation inaugurating them. Furthermore, those governing temperaments should reach their fullest expression at the peak of each generation's political power. And in fact, that is exactly what we see when we review American political history. Let's start by looking at the House of Representatives. In 1953, the greatest generation, a civic generation according to modern generational theory, won their first majority in the U.S. House. They reached the peak of their political power in 1965. In 1977, the silent generation, adaptives, took the majority for the first time. They reached the peak of their power in 1983. Then in 1995, baby boomers, an idealist generation, took over the House. They reached the peak of their power in 2009. The years we should be looking at are fairly similar in the U.S. Senate. The greatest generation won their first majority status in 1955 and reached the peak of their power in 1967. Silents got their first majority in 1977 and peaked in 1987. Boomers won the Senate in 1995 and peaked in 2011. Rather than assessing each chamber individually, it's actually more instructive to look at them together. The greatest generation took power in the early to mid-1950s and peaked in the 1960s. Silents took power in 1977 and peaked in the mid-1980s. Boomers took over in 1995 and peaked in the early 2010s. And the governing temperaments that we would expect from each generation are exactly what manifested in American politics. The early 1950s saw the beginning of an era of cooperation, optimism, humanism, expansion, and rationalism, which reached fullest expression in the mid-1960s. The late 1970s inaugurated the era of compromise, technocratic proceduralism, and establishmentarianism, which peaked in the mid-80s. And 1995 marks the beginning of the era of partisanship, polarization, gridlock, and moralization, which reached unfathomed heights in the early 2010s. But don't take my word for it. Look at what actually happened. Let's start with each generation's first majority. In the mid-1950s, the greatest generation took power, not only inaugurating an era of optimism, humanism, and cooperation, but a Democratic majority in the House that lasted 40 years. LBJ, the most powerful figure ever to serve in the Senate, ascended to the Senate's leadership and eventually to the presidency. 1953 coincides with the beginning of the Eisenhower presidency, a time of massive infrastructure investment, the beginning of the space race, and the civil rights era. And that was at least a decade before the greatest generation reached the peak of their power. The transformations of 1977, brought about by the arrival of the silent generation, are less well remembered, but they are actually among the most significant in American history. The rise of inequality in America is often blamed on Reagan's presidency, but many of the trend lines associated with inequality actually began in the late 70s rather than the early 80s. A careful study of the economic data makes it quite clear. Whatever transformed the United States from an egalitarian society into a radically unequal one started in 1977 and 1978. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson wrote a book documenting the specific policy changes and political fights that inaugurated this second Gilded Age. Their book is called Winner-Take-All Politics: How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class, and it is highly recommended reading. What Hacker and Pierson never realized, because they didn't know to look for it, is the role the silent generation played. Silents were the catalyst responsible for these changes. First Person Politics published a report called Sound of Silence: How the Silent Generation Put Big Money in Charge of Washington. In this report, we document the silent generation's role in ending the power of big labor in Washington. As hard as it is to believe from today's vantage point, prior to 1977, big labor used to call most of the shots in Washington. Newly elected members of the silent generation used their new silent majority to put an end to all that. In 1977 and 1978, big labor started losing and big business started winning legislative fights relevant to their interests. The 95th Congress inaugurated the era of tax cuts, deregulation, free trade, and anti-labor laws that put America on the path towards inequality. And it was the silent generation, not just collectively, but individual members from that generation, who did it. They trusted the business establishment and used technocratic policy changes as well as sophisticated parliamentary maneuvers to rewrite the rules of American political economy. American politics hasn't been the same since. At the beginning of this seminar, we argued that generational changes may matter even more than other factors like party or ideology. And the transformations of 1977 are a case in point. The tax-cutting, deregulating, free-trading laws that the silent generation initiated are today more associated with Republicans than with Democrats. But Democrats are in many ways just as responsible for these policies as Republicans. Consider that it was a Democratic Congress, not a Republican one, that passed the policy changes we've been talking about. In the 95th Congress, Democrats in both chambers had huge majorities, among the largest in modern history. Somehow, the party that represented the left, governing in a relatively liberal era of American history, with a huge popular mandate for liberal governance after the 1976 wave election, and big enough majorities to do pretty much whatever they wanted, took a very sudden and very dramatic turn to the right on economic issues. How on earth do you explain that? In conventional political terms, it makes absolutely no sense at all. Even when you account for the very slow and very gradual decline of the American labor movement and the equally gradual rise of corporate political activism, the ascent of the silent generation is the only thing that can explain this sudden and dramatic reversal, which transcended party and ideology. The changes that the boomers brought about with their first majority are remembered well enough, though these changes are usually pinned exclusively on Republicans. While Republicans do deserve a share of the blame, boomers are the primary culprits for the age of hyperpartisanship, polarization, and moralization that originated in 1995 when boomers won their first majority. In 1995, Republicans ended the Democratic Party's 40-year majority in the House, which, as you will recall, began with the rise of the Greatest Generation. Shutdowns, gridlock, and obstruction became routine, as did demonization of one's political adversaries. While political conflict has, of course, always been present, it took on a new intensity with the arrival of Newt Gingrich as House Speaker. Compromise came to be seen as a dirty word. Longtime policy staff serving in the House's standing committees were either let go or reassigned into political combat roles, and the culture wars became a matter of everyday concern in Washington. As of 1995, the days of compromise and conciliation were over. Politics would never again be the same. Let's now consider the era of each generation's peak power for more evidence that the political life cycle model works. The Greatest Generation reached the peak of its power curve in the mid to late 1960s. Well, what happened? We got what were arguably the most productive Congresses in all of American history. From historic civil rights legislation to Medicare and Medicaid, from massive infrastructure investment to major environmental legislation, the confidence, humanism, and expansiveness of the Greatest Generation was in full bloom. So much so that they can fairly be accused of arrogance and overreach. From Vietnam to the Great Society and the War on Poverty, the Greatest Generation perhaps had too much confidence in government to solve problems at home and abroad. By the mid-1980s, a new cohort was reaching the peak of its power, the silent generation. This was the era of deals between Tip and Ronnie, neither of whom were members of the silent generation, but whose compromises reflected the preferences of the silent majority. Tax reform, Social Security reform, immigration reform, and deregulation all passed during this era of conciliation and respect. For those who remember this era, and especially for those who worked in politics and government during this era, the defining feature of American civic life was how boring it all was. The big issues, such as they were mostly settled, and lawmaking was an exercise in arcane proceduralism and small tweaks to the status quo. Legislation was reduced to technocratic deal-making, and elections were fought over uninspiring differences. But this, too, was not destined to last. The 1994 wave election put boomers in charge, and the boomers reached the peak of their power in the early 2010s. This was the era of ubiquitous obstruction, hyper-partisanship, government shutdowns, debt ceiling brinkmanship, and broken government. Change only happened when one party had big majorities in both chambers of Congress, or on rare occasions when the president could bully members of the opposite party into passing his agenda. As a result, the do-nothing Congress has become the hallmark of boomer governance. Both qualitatively and quantitatively, the Congresses in peak boomer years have been among the least productive in American history, a testament to the baby boom generation's polarization and incompetence. Despite what it may look like from today's vantage point, American government will not be broken forever. In the late 1980s, it might have seemed like compromise and conciliation would reign eternal, just as in the mid-1960s, it would have seemed like government would always be ambitious and highly productive. At the peak of each generation's power, it often seems like the way things are today are inevitably the way things always will be. But that is not the case. Just as summer eventually gives way to fall and winter eventually gives way to spring, so too will the era of broken and dysfunctional government give way to something new and unexpected. And it will be the arrival of the next generation that will inaugurate the new era in American politics. Part 3. Generational Forecasting. We've already seen how the greatest generation came to power in the mid-1950s, how the silents took the majority in the late 1970s, and how boomers behaved once they won control in the mid-1990s. The next critical generational threshold will come near the end of the 2010s or the beginning of the 2020s, perhaps in 2019 or 2021, but no later than 2023. Based on the political life cycle chart, we would expect Generation X to win their first majority in 2017, but that's probably not going to happen. Gen X became the largest minority in the House only in 2009 and in the Senate in 2013. As of 2014, they hold 20% of the seats in the Senate and about 32% of the seats in the House. Given those numbers, it's very unlikely that Gen X will achieve a majority so soon. In fact, Gen X has been tardy all along, consistently reaching their political life cycle benchmarks a few years later than anticipated. They are the only generation in 150 years to have deviated from the political life cycle at all. So far, millennials, the generation coming up after them, appear to be hitting their benchmarks right on schedule. So it's unlikely that Gen X's belated ascent represents some kind of new historical norm that subsequent generations will follow. Far more likely, Gen X's delayed power curve is just an aberration. Indeed, it's fitting that a generation with a reputation for deviance would deviate from the norm. Xers are known for their distrust of authority, and perhaps that is why they are so reluctant to claim it, even when it's their turn. Today, members from the silent generation are shifting into elder statesman roles as their numbers decline. They are slowly exiting the leadership. Meanwhile, boomers remain dominant but have passed their highest peak. The polarization, gridlock, brinkmanship, and hyperpartisanship will no doubt continue until boomers lose their majority to Gen X around the end of this decade or the beginning of the next one. So what will Generation X's power and their rise to power mean for the future of American governance? Reactive generations like Gen X have a very different governing temperament than idealists like the boomers. Xers are competitive, cynical, direct, frugal, jaded, pragmatic, and pugnacious. A politics defined primarily by cynicism and directness looks very different from the polarized gridlock moralism of today. To get a sense of what this might look like, it's worth considering what happened the last time a reactive generation controlled Congress. The last reactive generation was the Lost Generation, born from 1883 to 1900. This generation dominated the halls of power from roughly the mid-1930s through the mid-1950s. The lost generation gets credit for most of the New Deal legislation, mobilizing the country during World War II and then demobilizing the country during its immediate aftermath. This generation also reorganized Congress itself into the modern committee system, restructured the relationship between business and labor, and established most of the national security agencies that have become a permanent fixture of the American government. President Truman may have called them do-nothing Congresses, but they managed to get quite a bit done, especially by today's standards. Known for straight talk, self-sacrifice, and a frugal get-it-done pragmatism, leaders of the lost generation could honestly claim the buck stops here. Now, history never repeats exactly, but it usually rhymes. Gen X probably won't expand the size and scope of government the way the lost generation did, but they will nonetheless accomplish a great deal. Another key difference is that Gen X will be taking power much later in America's fourth turning than their 20th century counterparts did. Their late arrival means America won't really get down to the business of solving our most pressing problems until after those problems have been allowed to fester for over a decade. Pragmatism and frugality may have reigned in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but it seems more likely that cynicism and pugnaciousness will be the prevailing ethos of Gen X's time in power. Here are some general observations about Gen X to help us get a better sense of what to expect from them. Today, the oldest Gen Xers are in their mid-50s and the youngest are in their mid-30s. Ideologically, this generation has a distinctly libertarian bent. They are resentful and distrusting of authority and have a hands-off mentality when it comes to government. Recent polling indicates there is a sharp split between Gen X's older and younger cohort. The older cohort, born in the 1960s, is extremely conservative. In many ways, they resemble their sharply ideological conservative boomer elders. The younger cohort, however, born in the 1970s, is a bit more libertarian or liberal-tarian, as some people like to call it. They look more like millennials, only they're much more individualistic, skeptical, and a bit more conservative on economic issues. We can confidently predict that Gen Xers will be overrepresented in the Republican Party. Gen X is alienated, sometimes verging on antisocial, competitive, cynical, and edgy. They also seem to have difficulty working in teams and participating in coalitions. Now, this story is purely anecdotal, but several Hill staffers have told me in private conversations that members of Congress from Gen X seem to be much more reluctant than older members to co-sponsor legislation, even when it would plainly be in their interest to do so. Reactive generations like Gen X are both known as and generally remembered for being the bad boys and bad girls of the generational cycle. Idealists like the boomers may be rebels, but Gen Xers seem to relish playing the role of the outlaw, the outcast, and the troublemaker. Hyper-competitive and status-obsessed, there's an aggressive and amoral edge to this generation that leads them to take major risks, which can quickly cross the line into abusive and even criminal behavior. Gen X isn't the only generation guilty of inexcusable behavior, but they're the ones who will probably be remembered for it the most. These are some of the faces of scandal, corruption, and abusive power from Gen X. Hopefully you'll recognize at least a few of them. Now, it's true that you can find examples of every type of misbehavior under the sun in every generation, but there seem to be patterns to the way generations get themselves into trouble. Boomers, for instance, will be remembered for their legendary sex scandals. Xers, on the other hand, I think will be remembered for their abuse of power, their campaign finance scandals, and for their occasionally sociopathic behavior. We can already see signs of this pattern emerging. We won't know for certain what Gen X governance will bring until they actually take power, but we can look to their young guns and rising stars for signs of what to expect. There are too many House members to list on even one slide from Gen X, so we're focusing on the Xers who have reached the presidential or vice presidential level, the senatorial or the gubernatorial level as well. Gen X's pugnaciousness is most evident in the figures on the Republican side of the aisle. The GOP is Gen X's natural ideological home, so we should not be surprised to see their generational traits and governing temperaments expressed more fully on that side of the aisle. From Sarah Palin to Ted Cruz, from Rand Paul to Chris Christie, this generation doesn't seem to have any problem speaking its mind or doing so in the most combative way possible. Some of their pugnacity may be a consequence of being the party out of power at the current time. In American politics, the out party is always a bit more outspoken and confrontational. On both sides of the aisle, these are men and women of action. They exemplify their generation's motto of just do it, almost to a T. From President Obama's pragmatism to Cory Booker's heroics in Newark, from Rand Paul's filibusters to Scott Walker's confrontations with labor, these leaders appear to be more interested in accomplishing what they can than in preserving their moral purity. However they behave in power, the changes that Gen X inaugurates around the turn of the decade will reach their fullest expression in the late 2020s. Millennials will achieve their first congressional majority in the late 2030s, beginning a new era of cooperation, optimism, humanism, expansion, and rationalism, which will peak in the mid to late 2040s. Behind them will be the plural generation, the 21st century iteration of the silence. And just like the silence did in the 1980s and early 1990s, they will usher in an era of compromise, proceduralism, and establishmentarianism in the early 2060s. Politics, for a time, will be boring again. The years listed on this table may be off by a cycle or two, but very unlikely much more than that. While politics and history are full of surprises, generational power curves are not among them. The plural generation being born today is an adaptive generation, like the now aging silence. They will be followed by another idealist generation like the boomers, then another reactive generation like Gen X, and then another civic generation like the millennials. The birth years listed here are highly speculative. We won't know the exact birth years of each generation until at least several years after they are born. But this gives you an idea of what the future history of American generations will look like. The plural generation has been given this name because they will be the first American generation in which no race or ethnicity will have a clear majority. Non-Hispanic whites in the plural generation will be just another minority group. As is typical of children born in a fourth turning, plurals are receiving strict and even smothering parenting from their predominantly Gen X parents. Instead of being optimistic, confident, and cooperative like their millennial elders, plurals will turn into an anxious and obedient helpmate generation. Millennials may be unabashedly progressive, but plurals will be much more conservative in a traditionalist sort of way. Unlike millennials who want to change the world, plurals will have no appetite for big changes, preferring technocratic incrementalism instead. When they enter the workforce in the late 2020s, they'll be looking for the safety and security of a stable 9-to-5 job, or whatever its equivalent is in the post-crisis economy. The idealist generation that follows the plurals will almost certainly be America's first majority Hispanic generation. Idealist generations have traditionally led history's great awakenings and religious revivals, so it would not be at all surprising to see the idealist generation born in the 2020s and 2030s revitalize the church, or perhaps even find meaning in a kind of neo-pagan mysticism drawn from the Mayan, Aztec, and Inca traditions. Idealist generations look inward in their search for authenticity, so it would not be out of character if this generation were to rebel against the millennial and plural integration with technology in favor of direct personal contact and experience. Echoing the boom generation's mantra of turn on, tune in, drop out, the idealist generation of the 21st century might declare turn off, tune out, drop in. One way or another, these young idealists will rebel against the consensus established by the millennial generation in its prime. By the time the next reactive and civic generations are born, Gen Xers will have largely died off, and the venerated millennials will be retiring. Very little can be said about the generations that will be born mid-century and beyond, but they will grow up in an America that is as different from today as today is different from the America of the 1960s and 1970s. Modern generational theory teaches us that history moves in seasons, and we are now well into a fourth turning or crisis, history's equivalent of winter. A fourth turning, as you will recall, is a period of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that can last up to about 20 years. Our present one began with the financial crisis in the fall of 2008, 79 years after the last major financial crisis ripped through the American economy, exactly one full seculum later. The financial crisis was followed by the Great Recession and the era of broken government, a period of economic and political dysfunction that rivals only the Great Depression, a seculum earlier. but the age of gridlock and polarization won't last forever. Fourth turnings have a predictable morphology, which is to say that they usually end in a major existential war of some kind, requiring total modalization of every facet of society. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II are all examples of fourth turning wars that transformed the nation and propelled it back into a first turning era of consensus and prosperity. We should expect another transformative total war near the end of the current decade or the beginning of the next one. Gen X's first majority in Congress may well end up coinciding with the beginning of this conflict, whatever its ultimate nature. Regardless of whether it ends in victory or defeat, or a little of both, it's not unreasonable to expect that the present fourth turning will end in the mid or late 2020s. When it does, America will be back into a first turning, an age of prosperity, consensus, and good feelings, and it will be millennials who more than anyone else define this era. It will last from the mid to late 2020s into the mid to late 2040s, and will be defined by a new sense of productivity and accomplishment as millennials finally settle down and raise families in the 21st century version of suburbia. It's likely that millennials will use digital technology to revitalize and redefine the American family, and will bring a new sense of cooperation, community, and comity to American civic life. The iHome, iWork, iNeighborhood, and iGov age will establish a new baseline set of expectations for the American social contract in the 21st century, as millennial and young plural parents give birth to a new generation of idealists. Mid-century will bring a set of rebellions from below against the millennial generation's rationalist paradise. Led by the majority Hispanic children of the millennials themselves, these individualistic and idealistic young crusaders could lead a revival of the church, of Latin culture, and they may even turn against the technocratic order established and treasured by millennials and plurals. Climate change could be a major element of the mid-century awakening. Even if millennials make fighting climate change a priority in midlife, it's likely that by mid-century, the effects of the carbon pollution already emitted into the atmosphere will be kicking into high gear. Young idealists may find themselves asking whether technology is the answer to climate change or its chief cause. And which is the most appropriate strategy for moving forward: prevention, mitigation, or adaptation? This is exactly the kind of ambiguous question that could pit one generation against another, because how you answer it depends on your subjective perceptions, values, and life experiences. It's far too soon to tell what the late 21st century unraveling will bring, but we suspect it will have an ecological or environmental component. Generational theory is archetypal, which means we can't always predict with precision what the future will hold. What we can predict are the very general patterns of behavior that we can expect from each generation and the social, economic, and political climates that those behaviors will produce. I can't realistically tell you what the weather will be like on August 2nd of next year, or the year after that, or a decade from now. But I can predict that it will be hot, the days will be long and the nights will be short, and many people will be on vacation in the final carefree weeks of summer. History works the same way, and since we're now moving through secular winter, we can expect hard times, bitter struggles, and the need for great sacrifices until secular spring comes again. American politics may seem broken and dysfunctional today, but it will not always be so. When the reactive Generation X comes to power in a few years' time, they will change many things, some for the better and some probably for the worse. Their pragmatism, cynicism, frugality, and pugnacity will transform Congress and American politics in ways that we cannot entirely foresee at this point, and they will likely do so in response to a series of genuine existential dangers. We can take some comfort from the fact that Gen Xers are about as well prepared as any generation for dealing with crises and disasters. Xers were born to survive. Throughout their lives, this generation has borne the brunt of America's neglect and contempt, and though Xers may resent it, it has strengthened them in ways that they themselves may not even realize. Xers can be cynical, callous, even ruthless, but they know how to perform triage in an emergency. They have what it takes to recognize what's truly important and fight for it as if their life depended on it. Soon, they will face this kind of test on a national, perhaps global scale. Whether this fourth turning ends well or ends badly for the United States, will be determined by the successes and failures of Generation X when it ascends into national leadership. Thank you for listening to Generations in Congress. First Person Politics is a consulting firm that uses political psychology to help you reach your goals. Our mission is to add a psychologically informed perspective to your work, bringing you the most powerful strategies, tools, and ideas that political psychology has to offer. If you have questions, want more information, or would like to hire us, please contact us today.